Good evening, everyone. I'm Sunil Badami and I'm delighted to welcome you to Balmain's historic Royal Oak Hotel for another Roaring Stories online author event on Facebook Live and here in the Royal Oak. We'll have time for questions later, so if you'd like to ask Jonica a question about Beyond Climate Grief, you'll have time to do so later. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of this country. Now, please remember to keep your phones on silent. There's always a little bit of movement here, isn't there? We don't want your favourite ringtone playing out across social media, do we? Because mine is Careless Whisper. You're welcome to take photos, but please turn your flash off. And please share your thoughts and pictures on Instagram, roaring_stories, Twitter, at Roaring Stories, Facebook, Roaring Stories 268. Don't forget to hashtag it with Roaring Stories and Beyond Climate Grief. Now, how do we find courage when climate change overwhelms us emotionally? After researching what global warming will do to the snow country she loves, award-winning science reporter Jonica Newby plummeted into a state of profound climate grief. And if she was struggling, she wondered, how was everyone else coping? What should parents tell their anxious kids? How might we live our best lives under the weight of this fearsome knowledge? When reality outstripped imagination, as when it happened in the ferocious rage of the apocalyptic 2025s last year. In this magical, funny and deeply moving personal story, Jonica explores how to navigate the emotional turmoil of climate change. Do you know what? I teach at university, and if right now I'd be sending people out of the room. Featuring illuminating conversations with singer-songwriter Missy Higgins, comedians Charlie Pickering and Craig Rucastle, and business leader Mike Cannon-Brooks, practical advice from psychological and scientific experts, incredible accounts from everyday heroes, plus inspiring stories from the Climate Strike kids. Beyond Climate Grief provides guidance and emotional sustenance to help shore up courage for the uncertainties ahead. And it reminds us how the love, beauty and wonder in the world, even amidst disaster, we can all have a touch of the epic hero in us. Jonica Newby is a TV producer, writer, director and presenter. She's won Australia's most prestigious science journalism prize, the Eureka Award, twice, and is a recipient of a World TV Award. Best known as a presenter on ABC TV's flagship science program, Catalyst, Jonica not only produced and directed over 200 stories for the show, but regularly commentates on TV, radio and in print, and is the author of the ABC book, The Animal Attraction, about how the domestication of animals created human civilization. She grew up in Perth, where she achieved a first-class honours degree in vet science and worked as a vet for a few years before becoming a professional science presenter and author. Welcome, Jonica.
Thank you.
Tough crowd. So, Jonica, we've heard a lot about a variety of emotional states, post-traumatic stress disorder, but what's climate grief?
Well, I didn't know until it happened to me. I hadn't actually heard of the term. So the way I think of it now is, okay, so I was a science reporter. I thought I knew a bit about climate change, but it turned out I only knew it intellectually. And so I had this incident in 2017 where all of a sudden it punched me emotionally. And I was actually quite felled by that experience. I wasn't expecting it. And I later came to describe that as climate grief.
So what was this experience that kind of punched you so hard emotionally?
Okay, so you have to go back to an idea that is quite a lot in this book. It has to do with love, and it's the idea that we actually fall in love with places just as we fall in love with people. I mean, can you guys think of a heart place right now? A place that you go to in your mind or physically, whatever? Well, one of my heart places is the snow. And I actually fell in love with snow before I even met it. So I'm going to read you something now from the very first chapter in the book. So each chapter in this book is actually told through the prism of a different emotion or mental state. But it's also a story, an adventure, a memoir. So this is the first chapter, Grief, My Love for Snow, a tale of magic, adventure, love, despair, and the fight to save winter. I've always wondered why I fell for snow, because I grew up on a beach on the edge of a desert, about as far from snow as you can get. Perth, Western Australia, 3,000 kilometres from the nearest mountains. Frankly, 3,000 kilometres from anywhere. So you think I'd be a beach babe, and I was. But as a little girl gazing at the white sand and clear blue water of Cottesloe Beach, somehow it was another white landscape that captured my imagination. A land of dramatic peaks and frosted statues, of sleigh bells and dragons and high-stakes adventures and the ever-present possibility of magic. My mind was being captured by snow. And if you think about it, so much of our imaginative world, our fantasy world, we've inherited through European or Northern Hemisphere traditions, and they have this beautiful, evocative, magical descriptions of snow. I think of all the great stories and then imagine them without snow, Snow White. Imagine Lord of the Rings set in Fiji. It doesn't have quite the same sort of resonance and thrill. And I think there is something really visceral and emotional about snow. It's both soft and precious and fragile and beautiful, and every snowflake is perfection. But it's also wild and dangerous, and there are summits of mountain peaks. So anyway, so snow filled my fantasy life, and then I got to move across to this side of the country, and I got to fall in love with a real snow place, Kunama Namaji, Australia's snowy mountains. And so in between, and by this stage I'd become a science reporter of the Catalyst, and you'd think that, I'd be all about logic, and I was during the week. But on the weekends in winter, I would go and visit my fantasy place. And I would even, and I don't put this in the book because it's too embarrassing to admit, I actually used to put on Lord of the Rings soundtrack on my drive down just to get me in the fantasy mood, And so then I'd go up on the snow country and I'd, be up top, and there'd be wombats in their snow caves and sparkling things and the snow gums, they glitter. They have these jewel colours of reds and ruby reds and sapphires and so on in the bark, and then they're chandelier-like leaves that glitter as they're covered in ice. But they were separate, this fantasy world and my real world of science reporting, until they began to clash. So I was on this once-in-a-lifetime holiday in Japan in 2017. And I was having a great time, I was skiing powder for the first time, I was visiting onsens, I was hanging out with Swiss ski instructors on holidays. Hang on, what is a Swiss ski instructor doing on holidays here? It's January, his busiest time of the year. So I asked my new friend, Axel, and he said, I just wanted to find some good snow. Well, I was shocked. Apparently Switzerland had had a green Christmas that year. And then later that week, half the Great Barrier Reef died. And I'm a science reporter. I knew what that meant. I knew that most of that coral was never coming back. And as I looked around at my beautiful fantasy place, I suddenly realised, it's going to get this too. And I didn't even know how to deal with that overwhelm. And when I got back, I couldn't get on with what I was originally going to do. I ended up researching snow for a year, by the end of which I hit a state where I actually went to my doctor asking for antidepressants. Climate grief.
So, is this the book you expected to write?
No, not at all. I had a really great plan, and originally I didn't even intend to write a book. I mean, I spent time working through my climate grief, and I only took one of the pills, as it turned out. This is the first story in the book, and I actually did something very different. When I decided that I would write a book, which was in 2019, I had this fantastic plan, I thought. And the reason I did it was because I'd started hearing other people telling similar stories to me. And I was realising that I couldn't be the only person struggling with this. So, anyway, great plan. I'm going to do the same thing as Lee Sales with Any Ordinary Day. I would start with my own story, and then all the different chapters would be different fascinating people that I visit and get their take and, positive emotions, and, there's chapters on courage and joy and humour and all these sorts of things. Yeah, that kind of still happened, but I started writing in October 2019, and within weeks the fires started, and it was like the climate fire gods were coming for us. I know there were times when all of us felt like we had fallen into the plot of a film or a novel. And so the book had to change. It took on this absolute narrative structure instead of separate chapters. It became like a memoir of trying to write a book during this time. And when even, the newspapers were starting to use apocalyptic language and the language of epic narratives. So the book took on this really quite big adventure story in a way, and this whole epic, almost novelistic tone. So,
Now, the fires, I mean, we were all touched by the fires. Every day waking up to smoke. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The year Australia's had, we were able to use the masks that got us through the fires to get us through the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah.
But the fires had a very personal impact on you personally. What was that?
So, let's look at December. So in December, I went to visit a family in Namboida. Namboida, if you remember, that was one of the first whole towns that got obliterated. And I went to visit this family who I'd met the daughter through the Climate Strike Kids, which are another chapter in the book. Fabulous chapter. And I went up there because I thought, well, this is as close to a fire as I'm going to get, isn't it? I better go as a journalist and spend some time with these people and just talk to them and see what they're feeling and what it's like. And I had this fantastic weekend. The irony is that chapter was the one that I was exploring the concept of denial and why it is that we never ever think disaster is going to come for us. So there I was, writing a chapter about how we never think disaster is going to come for us. And within 2 weeks, New Year's Eve happened, and my mother lives in Malakuta. So I woke up in the morning. By that stage, I was at Jirowa. I was on the south coast. Many of my friends live in the south coast, up and down. And I woke up that morning, and I looked at the fires and I just started shaking and crying because it was about to hit within 10 minutes from the direction that my mother's house is. She's right on the forest. So, I then went, frankly, into disaster brain. I mean, talk about states of mind that you don't really know you're going to end up writing about. After that, I had to add all these extra chapters.
What is disaster brain?
Yeah, disaster brain, we've all felt it, I think, with COVID and the fires. Basically, you end up in this adrenalised state, and in the really acute phases, which is to say the people who were actually full on, in the fires, then it's full on survival brain, and they do all sorts of things like their brain, our brains shut down, our vision and our hearing and our smell are heightened, our ability to process cognitively is reduced. So disaster brain, I came to, that seemed to be the best phrase, talking to the different disaster psychologists and psychiatrists that I spoke to during this time. It was sort of that low adrenaline state where we're all in all the time, you know, where you just sort of feel edgy, a bit edgy. I think we all remember that. We had it again when COVID hit. And the other thing that's really...
I had it trying to get onto the WestConnex tunnel.
Yeah, I know that feeling. Every time I come to Sydney, the drive kind of gives me that. But yeah, but what it does, and I'm sure the WestConnex tunnel, you're going to end up with PTSD after that one. But it means that we can only focus on what's ahead of us. So we tend to only focus, you know, a few days at a time. So again, I think with COVID, I did nothing but listen to Coronacast. I stopped listening to the news.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we had those devastating floods in Queensland, are you going to stay back after class? I can't wait to hear what a ringtone sounds like. So, I mean, you might remember back in 2007, 2008, the devastating floods in Queensland, where a lot of people found that they didn't actually have, or they weren't going to get coverage for flood damage and stuff like that. And it's interesting, a lot of people, while they donated to flood rescue for those people, there were a lot of snippiness saying, well, you live on a floodplain, what do you expect? I mean, I guess a lot of people might say the same thing about people who live near forests or in Mallacoota or places where there could be fire. What was the difference this time? And how do people, you know, living in very forested areas like the Blue Mountains or down near Mallacoota, how do they cope with the threat of all this fuel, you know, potentially going up every few years?
Depends whether they've got PTSD, honestly. Quite a few people who've actually been through the fires end up with what's called a trigger phobia. And I had a little bit of one myself, and I write about it in the Disaster Brain chapter, where I went to visit a friend, and her house is in the trees, and I'd just been down to Mallacoota and had quite a, you know, emotional experience down there. And I saw, and all I could see was flames coming up. So I think for the people who have ended up with trigger phobias, it's really hard. For the rest of them, we just slip straight back into denial, because fear is an emotion that unfortunately is very short term, which is why it doesn't work that well to motivate us for climate change, except in an acute crisis situation. So fear, from an evolutionary point of view, is designed to spike and drop, right? And then when the fear is past, you kind of have all your chemicals have to settle back down. And so I think for the people who are living in the forests and so on, if I can speak from my mum, she's just kind of ignoring it.
So did she move back to Mallacoota?
Yeah, of course she did. Yeah, it's her home. It's her home. And they'll just figure they'll have a fire plan and they'll run if it happens again. And I think there's a bit of fatalism. I think community is more important to people than fear.
Yeah.
So, I mean, many people around the world can't forget those indelible images of, you know, apocalyptic images of families trying to shelter on the beach under those, you know, blood red skies at Mallacoota on New Year's Eve. What was it like for people in that situation? I mean, we didn't seem to hear a lot from them. We just saw the images. What was it like for people, you know, in the water as the world burnt around them?
Yeah. It was incredible, and the reason we didn't hear from them is that they were actually cut off. In fact, they thought we'd all forgotten them. They didn't know that the fires had hit all the other towns up and down the coast. They thought it was just them and that we'd forgotten them, but that was the sheer scale of what was going on. But yeah, look, I went back into, fortunately my mum did get out in time, but we didn't know whether the house was going to go or not. I thought it would, for sure.
I mean, with a fire plan, we know it's about maybe saving yourself and saving the house, but how do people plan for... Because I've always had a little hard drive of all our family photos by the door, just in case. And I put everything up on the cloud. But there must be things that are how do you take the antique dresser?
Yeah, and Mum actually didn't. Most people, they think they've got a fire plan, but they don't actually prepare as if it could really happen. And I found that again and again with people I was talking to, some who did lose their houses, others who didn't, and they didn't take any of the things that they really, really wanted sentimentally. They hadn't thought it through, so I certainly learnt that. And my mum is classic. She left all our family photos from my great-grandmother and everyone in the house. These beautiful photos from Norway from generations ago, and we've spoken about that since, but that's what happens when people go into that survival mode. They go very calm often. But
have you moved the photos?
I've asked her to make sure it's on the evacuation list next time, goodness. My brother's up the back there, he's nodding in agreement, yes. Exactly. But to go back to your question about what it was like to be there, I don't think any of us really understood, and I wrote a chapter that I didn't know was ever going to be in there, where I went back into Mallacoota as soon as the roads were open. If you remember, it was all closed. So it was about 3-4 weeks after the event. And I didn't have a plan, I just wanted to be there. That was the same day my mum got back in as well. And so I wandered round and just spoke to Mum's friends about what it was like. I didn't talk to experts, I didn't talk to people who were in the RFS. These were just ordinary people. And the stories I got were incredible, and it's put together this just incredibly uplifting, surprisingly, and vivid description of what it was like to be there on the day. And so this is told from about 5 or 6 different points of view, so I can only read to you one of them, but this is the one I call Nick and the Disaster Movie Sprint. And it is incredible. So a couple of the people in Mallacoota decided to stay and defend. They were told that they would not get supported, they were on their own, and they decided to stay and defend the place they love, their heart place. So this young man, Nicholas, in his 30s, never fought a fire before. He got briefed by his father-in-law, who was up the other end of the same street trying to protect his home, and they had walkie-talkies, so they thought they were really well prepared. But just to set the scene, when the fire came, the roar was so intense that none of them, the walkie-talkies were useless. They were in smoke. They were in, it was nearly pitch black apart from the actual fires. It was an absolute sensory overwhelm. So in this context, here we go with Nicholas. Unexpectedly on his own, fortified with the desire to protect the life he's built, Nicholas enters survival mode, running up and down the street, fighting spot fires with buckets of water, occasionally a hose. At one point, a power line came down on the road out in front of my house and it all started sparking. Oh God, my hand is at my mouth again. And then everything was blazing behind me, and then everything in front of me was on fire as well. And I just thought, well, I can't go inside the house because all the houses are burning. And then I thought, well, if things get too bad, I'll just zip down to the beach on my bike and I'll kind of hide under the cliff face. That was my genius plan. Good one, I nod. It worked. Well, not really, he laughs. So I jumped on my bike and then I head to the beach. Like a scene from a movie, he pedals like the wind down a corridor of fire. All the houses ablaze, all the tea trees ablaze, flames flying 4 times their height, fireballs arcing overhead. It was just raging through the air, and I get there and there's a staircase that goes down onto the beach, and that was on fire. And I ditched my bike and then I ran down the burning stairs. But the fire actually came down the cliff face and the beach was on fire. All the tussocks, and I saw them start burning down the beach and heading into town, and I was like, holy shit! And I couldn't go that way, and it was burning down the cliff face, so I ran to where the boat ramp is. I got up to the top of my bike, it was burnt to a crisp, and then another front came through, but on the other side, and it went all the way down to the boat ramp, and I was kind of stuck in the middle then, so I had to run through the golf course. My jaw is on the floor, as Nicholas describes running from the flames, ending up doing a 2-kilometre high-speed loop around the back of the firefront to the other end of Terra Nova Drive, checking on his father-in-law, then sprinting back to his end to pick up a bucket again, where if anything, conditions are worse. There was fire everywhere, pretty much every fence was on fire, and then the bushes, trees, houses, And then it kind of escalated. Houses would catch on fire, and then the next house would catch on fire. Everything at that time was just chaos, really. I was just running. Amid this sensory and emotional overload, with 10 houses burning around him, Nicholas's brain encodes a new knowledge, the dreadful keening sound a home makes just before it dies. It starts chuffing, like it's burning on the inside. It starts chuffing, and you can see it. The windows start to bend, and then bam, the windows pop, and it just explodes like a freaking bomb. And then just the thought in your head, like the animals, all the trees. Nicholas looks up, grieving. It's like all the things, the beauty this place has to offer is burning in front of you, and it's out of your control, you know? There's nothing, really. You're just a person with 2 buckets.
I mean, you've talked about, the comedian Charlie Pickering has talked about freeze. You know, where he talked about having, collecting all these parking tickets and just putting them in the drawer and not paying them and just thinking, well, eventually, they go away, And there's no doubt that if you think of, say, the 7 stages of grief, then the first stage has to be denial, and a lot of us seem to be in denial. I mean, you're talking about climate change or climate grief being intellectual. I mean, we can see that effect, in those blood red skies and everything burning around us. But when people start talking about ppm and emissions and offsets and blah, 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 it seems so numbery. It's very hard to kind of pass all that data. So I guess a lot of us, especially here in the city, you might put up some solar panels and drive a Prius and take our own bags to the shopping centre, but it almost seems like the equivalent of 2 buckets against a big fire front. I mean, is it too late for us? Have we reached the point of no return with the coral never coming back?
Well, that would make my book a bit pointless, wouldn't it? Look, the point about the 2 buckets, that guy saved his house. He didn't think he was going to. He saved 5 houses with those 2 buckets. And it just struck me as what an amazing metaphor it was for all of us with climate change. We're just a person with 2 buckets, But everything we do does matter. And there's a quote right at the end of the book in the chapter called Meaning, which is another one of the chapters I had to add because this whole journey became so epic that it ended up cliche in the search for meaning. And Gandhi is attributed with a quote that says, "Whatever you do will be insignificant, but it is essential that you do it." Now, in terms of us freezing and being in denial, I guess the point is that you have to connect emotionally with what is at stake for you personally. This comes back to this personal tipping point, the moment when you might hit climate grief or climate anger, or, I asked my partner, Robin, do you feel climate grief? He says, no, I feel universal rage. Which I saw a lot, where the men all said, I'm angry, and the women all said, I'm sad.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think? Because women, it seems a lot of women seem to be at the forefront of climate action, like Greta Thunberg. Why are men angry and women sad? Is that a genetic thing, or is it a social thing, in terms of perhaps men thinking they can solve things but they can't solve this? Or?
It does tend to be their response. I mean, all jokes aside, I did actually ask everyone in the book what they felt. I didn't always write that down, but it was interesting that most of the men said they were angry and they used that to motivate themselves, and most of the women said more that they were sad. And I think whichever emotions motivate you, they're the ones you have to harness. For myself personally, anger actually demotivates me. It makes me feel paralysed and overwhelmed. And when when you know the anger comes at you from the say the Fox Newses and so on, it feels horrible. It feels paralysing. So I was much more looking for a way through that spoke to me emotionally, and perhaps this is a more female book. Perhaps it is. I think it probably is, because a lot of the books that have been out there have been, you know, either body count, the ways we're all going to die, which is a perfectly legitimate book, but I can't read that one. Or, you know, here's what we need to do. I personally needed something that talked more about how I go through this knowledge emotionally without being overwhelmed. And as I said, if you connect emotionally with what's going on and think about what it means for you personally, then I think it's easier in a way. Look, you're going to hit the overwhelm at times, but that's okay, because grief's a roller coaster. That's okay, you know. Acknowledge it as a grief and it's fine. But the whole point of connecting with it emotionally is, if you think about love as an emotion, love of people, love of place, it was designed to last long term, and it's there to make us protect whatever we love. Now, I actually had a story in the book about my partner, Robin Williams, and the point where he managed to die right in front of me, and after 3 minutes, he was white, and I had to attempt CPR, and I didn't know how to do it, and I thought whatever I did would be useless. And it's a very vivid thing for me, and a pretty vivid thing in the book. Obviously, he's still here. It has a happy ending. But it made me ask the question, what would you do to protect the one you love? And the answer is, you do whatever you can. I didn't know. That was my 2 buckets, trying to, you know, do CPR when I actually learned it when I was 10 in swim class, you know, but it worked. And so if we think about the climate actions as what would you do to save what you love, well, then you don't give up, do you? You just keep going. And it's never too late. I mean, I think we'll be looking back on this year as, on 2020, as a real social tipping point. But obviously these things are in so much turmoil now that it's hard to see.
Well, I mean, you do confess to some personal problems with hope in the book, and that you're starting to mistrust hope. Why?
Because hope has let me down a bit. Has that happened to anyone else? You know? Yeah. It's like when Mr. Trump...
Cynicism is served just for
when Mr. Trump, you know, was elected, I felt terrible. When you think things are going to happen and they don't, it leaves you really vulnerable to despair. And so, yeah, there's a beautiful chapter I call Courage, because I heard this fantastic podcast from a fabulous woman called Anna Rose. And she talked in the podcast about courage and how this word is made up of kur for heart and raj for anger. So the anger to protect what you love, that is what courage is. And I thought that's what we always fall back on when hope looks a bit grim. What my grandparents fell back on and said, well, when things didn't look great. What we fall back on when our partners have cancer or whatever. We fall back when our hope temporarily fails us. We can fall back on courage. And it's something that you can whisper to yourself, you know, quietly. Have courage, and it gives you that, and it's contagious. When you see other people having courage, you have courage too. It's a beautiful emotion.
But I mean, you know, like going back to the idea of the 2 buckets, often we hear the refrain that, well, Australia only produces 1.4% of all global emissions, so even if we did something, it wouldn't matter because bigger emitters will do it anyway. I mean, how can small actions kind of, or individual actions have any impact, let alone a big one?
Well, they may not. They may not. Let's be honest. I'm not Bill Gates. You know, his 2 buckets are probably a lot more effective than mine, but it doesn't mean you don't do it. You go back to to Gandhi's quote. You know, we'll all be bringing our tribes to this. There's another idea. There's quite a few Lord of the Rings references in the book, I have to tell you, which is great if you love Lord of the Rings. But the idea of actually every one of us has to bring what we have to this battle, to this epic battle. I mean, I did actually end up thinking of it that way. And so, yes, maybe we don't have, I don't have as much to give as Twiggy Forrest or Mike Cannon-Brookes, who's another great character in the book, with his fantastic visions and the money to actually make them happen. But every little bit, it's like the Gandhi quote, whatever you do will be insignificant, but you still have to do it. And there's so many examples in this book, like the beautiful story of the Castlemaine kids. You know, 3 kids actually helped kickstart the global movement. I mean, which is another story I might go into in a second. But there are so many stories of these individual actions having an enormous impact. And even if ours personally don't, you know what? We need to do it to be able to live with ourselves. Mm-hmm. If we actually engage with the emotions the emotional reality of climate change, well then we actually have to do what we can to live with ourselves. And it'll add up.
So what can we do? You know, what can we do if we... I mean, my children are very energetic. They've got better backs than me, so they can stand around holding a sign for hours, and I'm not a lobbyist, and what can I do or we do to make that change, even if it's incremental but essential?
Well, I'm going to flip back on that, because I will honestly say this book is not about what we should do, because there are a lot of books out there like that. I wanted a book that talked to me about how we feel and why we should do it. And I actually say at the end, you know, I can't tell you what to do, but just know that if you love the planet, your kids, whatever your heart place is, you'll do something. You'll do whatever you can, and you probably do a little bit more each year. For me personally, I'm a work in progress. I'll be looking for new things each time. One of the charities now, activist groups that I'm involved with, is Market Forces, and a few of the ones that are lobbying the various companies to do things like pull out of Adani, get rid of fossil fuels, all that sort of thing. That's a pressure point. 350.org. Look, each of us are going to have different individual actions on top of, you know, having solar panels, reducing your own personal emissions. There's someone in the audience here who has put together a personal carbon counter. I mean, there's various things, so many things that one can do. But as I said, I think we won't do it unless we all as individuals work out how to not hit the overwhelm so much that it hits that we go back into freeze or denial. So yeah, that's really the important thing for me, how we navigate the emotions around this.
We often think about, you know, gallows humour. When things are really bad, we can tell jokes, terrible jokes. Actually, I've got a climate change joke, Jonica, if you want to hear it.
Please, I'd love to.
So, why do they play so much Black Sabbath in wind farms?
I didn't know they did, but yes, why do they?
Because wind farms are full of heavy metal fans. I don't know if that's the kind of humour that will get us through climate grief. Okay. Yeah, I'm a dad, that's what I do. Also, I hog the remote. So, Jonica, tell me, you talk to a lot of people who aren't climate scientists, such as comedians Charlie Pickering and Craig Rucastle. What is so funny about climate change apart from wind farm jokes, and how can humour help us deal with climate grief?
Well, it's essential. It's essential to helping us. I always wanted to include a chapter on humour in this, because it struck me when I was dealing with Robin's illness, which is the second chapter in the book called Love, how the worse things got, the more ridiculous and funny and silly the newsletters I was putting out about his progress went, because they made him laugh and they kind of took away a lot of the tension. And it was really fascinating to me that as the fires got more and more into a sort of godlike, monster-like status, I was asking everyone whether they were making jokes about, even a coral scientist, who was talked about weeping into his mask very vividly. I said, and then what jokes did you tell? And they all laughed when I said that, because they all did tell jokes after these incredible experiences, after losing their homes or whatever. These girls had all lost their homes. They sat around joking. And you know why? Charlie Pickering, actually, because he's a fabulous interview in this, he said, I think humour is there to make the world feel okay. And he is more right than he could possibly know, because I happen to know a fabulous evolutionary biologist, Robin Dunbar in Oxford, who's like one of the guys. And he's written quite a lot about the evolutionary role of humour. And when you look at laughter, it's actually really ancient. It predates humans, primates do it. And it signals that this is okay, that it's safe, that it's playful. And in the moment you're all laughing, you are doing two things biologically. You're defragging your physiology, all those stress hormones, they're kind of settling down again. But the other thing is you're releasing oxytocin. It's a profoundly bonding hormone. And so in that moment, say if you've just been through a terrible fire, if you're making a joke around where you're sitting later, probably not a campfire, you actually, all in that moment, in that laughter, are telling each other chemically that you're safe right now, that you got through it, and that you are not alone. So humour, for all the laughs, is terribly, terribly important in coping with climate grief. And yeah, I asked everyone their jokes, and they're all in the book.
So grief, humour, anger, there's a huge range of emotions to deal or address climate. You cover a whole range of emotions, responses to climate change. What do you think the most important emotion to harness to address climate change could be?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is so important, and it was the idea I had even before I knew that it was going to turn in. I have this line at the end of the book in the chapter meeting saying, this is not the adventure I thought it would be. I started out expecting Lord of the Rings, not the road. If you remember what it was like during the fires. But look, this idea of fear spiking and dropping again, that's why I think it's not the best way for most of us to motivate for climate change. It's super important, and it's super important that we're motivated by fear often, but we can't live that way. It becomes chronic, it becomes stress, it becomes paralysing. But if you think about love, and love is the emotion that most speaks to me, then you can sort of almost go, I will do what I can to save what I love. And in my case, it's not just the people, it's the snow. But there's one other emotion that is related to love that I think is powerfully motivating, and that's why it's the second last chapter in the book. And that is pride. Now, pride gets a bad rap because there's, it's hubris. But there are two sorts of pride. And, when we say, what is the highest accolade we can give a friend or a member of our family? It is, I'm so proud of you. That is the thing that brings us to tears, because the emotion of pride is what I would call, what the sociologists call a pro-social emotion. It's an emotion that only exists in the context of our community and our group and our loved ones. It is basically, it's the emotion, it's probably one of the highest emotional rewards we get to have, and we usually have it for other people. We don't feel proud of ourselves. It's often a selfless emotion. We feel proud of those that are with us. And it basically is the emotion you get for doing right and doing your best by your community. And I think if you look at the fires, for example, and COVID, what is the emotion? What is it we say? We're a bit proud of Australia, how we've done. We're a bit proud of everyone. I burst into tears every time I saw an RFS volunteer. Did anyone else have that? And that emotion was
Tony
pride. Yeah. Oh look, I will not talk about that man.
Now, we'll take a few questions from you. For some reason, I kind of imagine there might be a few questions here tonight, Jonica. That's the vibe. Now, for the benefit of our friends on Facebook and Facebook Live, what I'll do is when you ask the question, I will repeat the question just for everybody on Facebook Live so they can hear the question, and then Jonica will answer. But because time is limited, please limit yourself to a question, not a statement, rumination, or meander. Try and keep it to at least 2 or fewer subordinate clauses, and I will be listening for the inflection at the end, okay? If you do go on, I will be forced to wind you up, so please keep it short and sweet. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Yes, you, young lady.
Okay, Monica, you talk about love, snow and fire. I wanted to know the significance on an enchanted bee can.
Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, there are multiple reasons for that. First of all, I wanted to write a book that I would want to read. You know, a lot of the books are really depressing.
Oh, sorry. Look. There's me. So, Jonica, tell us about the enchanted beer can.
Yeah.
Why don't I answer that again? So, yes, I wanted to write a book that I would actually enjoy reading. And that would hint that it would have some jokes in it, that there'd be a sense of magic, and nothing too, well, look, there's truth bombs in it because this is reality, but I think the book is actually ultimately uplifting. So the Enchanted Beer Can had a couple of functions. One is sort of channeling this Lord of the Rings vibe that I found myself falling into, because it did feel at times like we were living some sort of epic narrative, as I was saying, and that comes through in the book. And Tolkien, actually, I want to make a point about Tolkien. So I mentioned Tolkien at the beginning of the book because it's part of how I ended up falling in love with snow, was like reading Lord of the Rings. But later on, I was struck by this notion that oh my goodness, when the snow realisation came, we're sort of living that story. You know, it's literally black coal versus pure white snow, and we don't know which is going to win. And later on in the book, when there's this professor of psychiatry who becomes like my sort of teacher character, he's like this wise man that I ended up literally ringing nearly every week and talking to. And he pointed out that it was no accident that these epic events of climate change remind me of Lord of the Rings, because of course Tolkien was writing straight after World War I and World War II. And this is the beginning of the chapter called Creativity. Sandy, the professor, pointed out to me, said he turned his trauma and grief into that epic fantasy that was basically about World War II. So now it's no accident that we can feel like these events sometimes are a bit out of a story. So I wanted to give that sense of enchantment and the story. But the other thing is, the Enchanted Beer Can is just funny. You know, it's really sweet. And Charlie Pickering actually tells that story, and I feel like I shouldn't tell you the story. You should actually read it in the book.
Oh, come on, you can't say it. It's like someone saying, oh, I've got something really... No, don't worry. It's okay, no.
Shall I tell that one?
Go on.
Okay, it's just a little story, but it was to do with the fires, and we were talking about the role of humour. And this was actually before our fires happened, but he was remembering the fires from Black Saturday because he's based in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And he said a comedian friend of his actually told him a story, because the comedian went up and did lots of sessions around the towns that were affected so badly by the fires. Again, that role of humour, so important. And anyway, so the comedian came back with this story. I don't even think it's that funny. It's just sweet. So apparently there's this guy on Black Saturday who had stayed to defend, didn't realise that, of course, it was going to be apocalyptic, and that these fires were on a scale no one had ever seen before. And he's on his property, he's by himself, and over the hill comes this wall of flame just coming down toward him, and he looks at it and he goes, geez, if my time's up, I'm doing it with a beer in my hand. So he goes to the fridge, he gets out the VB, he pops the VB, and at that moment, the wind changes and the fire goes away. So Charlie was really struck, and I just thought it was such a sort of, great Australian laconic moment and quite beautiful. And so Charlie was actually acting out, this magical beer can sending the fire away.
Any other questions?
What did you say about the role of greed?
I'm just going to ask that question for Facebook. What would you say about the role of greed in climate change?
I don't address it in the book because I'm trying not to depress myself or any of my readers, despite the reality of the couple of truth bombs in it. Not many. Greed, look, I didn't actually say this in the book, but I was even disturbed, and we all have been, during COVID and during the fires, that there seemed to be a number of people who were actually incredibly selfish. Most of the community were the opposite. Most of us, when the chips were down, showed incredible courage, compassion, gratitude, and generosity. And that actually gave me so much faith that when we finally wake up to the reality, we will actually turn this around quickly. But the ones that hit the newspapers were the ones who were not doing the right thing. And I just had to think to myself, okay, I'm just going to say 20% of the population is on the sociopathic spectrum, and I'm going to concentrate on the 80% who aren't. Because it's the only way I could kind of process that reality as well. And that's what we're fighting too. We're fighting the selfish people. We're fighting the greedy people.
It's just such a shame that most of them are in Parliament.
Well, they tend to be quite proud of themselves in Parliament rather than having pride in others.
Any other questions?
Did you talk to anyone who is in an industry which they love but is opposed to climate change? For instance, maybe someone in the coal industry or maybe an agriculturally damaging industry, and the unique climate grief that comes with being at odds with where it needs to go.
So do you speak to, or do you know any people who work in what might be termed as kind of climate damaging or not necessarily climate friendly industries, like say for example coal mining or cotton farming? And sorry, what was the next part of the question? Let's just do that one. Yeah, how do you talk to those people? I mean, it is such an emotive. When we talk about emotions, it seems climate change is such an emotive discussion. People are very set in denying or wanting action. How can we come together to talk, in that spirit of community and communion?
To answer firstly, no, I didn't speak to those people, and one of the reasons was that the fires came and any plans I had just kind of went out the window, and so the book became this memoir of me struggling to actually, put together a book about these emotions at a time of such turmoil. But I take your point, and for those people, when they start to shift across, they're going to end up with really bad cognitive dissonance, and obviously that does lead to denial. So honestly, most of the people in the book were all people who already had that personal tipping point in some way or fashion. But look, one of the things, actually it's a beautiful passage. I haven't talked about Missy Higgins yet, but Missy Higgins is one of my favourite chapters in the whole book. She's so soulful, she's so wonderful. And she actually had some really great advice for me and for all of you about some really simple strategies to help you with your climate grief. But I had this vision, like she had to turn all her climate grief into songs. That was what her creativity did, and they are beautiful songs, and they appear in the book, although because you can't hear them. Well, my creative mind just kept seeing this vision of bloody Lord of the Rings. I kept seeing all these tribes coming to the fore and bringing their people with them. And the answer is that people like in the coal industries and so on, they need to hear from their own people. You know, you need to bring your own tribe. And Rebecca Huntley, Anna Rose, I mean, there's so many people who are really quite expert in that, and that's why they work tirelessly to actually help all these different speakers within these different tribes to actually support their colleagues and friends as they too reach that point of getting past their denial and realising that this reality is there. Sure, there's a lot of people in denial still, but I hope it's moving. I hope that answers some of your question.
Yeah.
One last question. Sorry, yes, gentleman over there.
Yes, Tonica, who are the 2 or 3 key people who have informed you in terms of the way you've shaped your view of the world?
So, Jonica, who are the 2 or 3 key people who have helped inform your view of the world?
Interesting. Yeah, my brother at the back is pointing out himself. Just in case.
Robin's not putting his hand up.
No, he's hiding. In terms of this book, that's an interesting question. I honestly think I learnt some of the most effective strategies from Missy Higgins. And one of those is curating what news you get. And basically, for someone like me, where the anger actually is really quite toxic, I'm careful now about subscribing to good news websites that have good news on the climate, and to balance out the stuff I hear through the other news. So that was really influential and very soulful. Who really influenced me on this journey? Look, one of the people is someone who isn't really in the book that much, though I did speak to her privately, but her idea, her concept is probably one of the most important things that, again, worked for me. And there's lots of different ideas in the book, so that I'm hoping people will find different things speak to them. But this is the idea of active hope, and this is Joanna Macy, who's in her 90s now. And I was introduced to this concept of active hope by a number of different people. There's a lot of people who've hit the climate overwhelm that have actually turned to the philosophy of active hope. And this is, to try and sort of quickly summarise it, it's the idea that you hope in the traditional sense can leave you vulnerable and it lets you down. Whereas this thing called active hope is where you look at the worst possible future, or a possible future, or maybe the possible future we've got with clear eyes, and you let those emotions come and you let them go through you. You don't back away from them. Because she says actually it's like Drano for the soul. People are scared that if they let the grief in, that they'll just get stuck there, but actually you do tend to move through, and that is what has happened to me. So you hold that picture in your head of what you're grieving, and that's just showing that you honour something that you love, and that's okay. But then there's this other side where you picture the future, the best possible future you can imagine, and how you would like that to be. And so your gift of active hope is this action that you will do for that outcome. And she actually uses quite a lot of science fiction, fantasy references. She talks about talking about then using this moment as a call to adventure. So you go, okay, what would Frodo do? Well, I guess I'd do that. You use it as a call to adventure, and so the rest of your life is that. And then your gift of active hope is where you catch an inspiring vision, whatever yours is. It might be different to someone else's. And you give your action for that. The rest is out of your hands, but you do that. And it's beautiful, and that's why so many people referred me to it, because it actually does give you a way of thinking through it.
Well, thank you very much for all your great questions, and thank you, Jonica, for such an enchanting conversation. Beyond Climate Grief is published by New South Book Publishing, and Jonica's available for a chat when she signs your copy. In fact, you know what? Don't be the guy, just be the person with 2 buckets. Be the person with 2 books, one for you and one for someone in your community. You can buy it here tonight, or in the Royal Oak, or in store at Roaring Stories, online on Facebook Live. Just click on the link, or go to the Roaring Stories website at roaringstories.com.au. And sign up for our newsletter packed with exclusive offers, new releases, interviews with your favourite authors, events, exclusively curated Spotify playlists, and more. And if you're in Balmain and surrounding suburbs, postage is free. And don't forget our next Roaring Stories online author event at the Royal Oak, here on Monday the 29th of March, with renowned economist Ross Garnaut talking about how the COVID-19 pandemic might offer Australia an opportunity to reset economically, ecologically and socially, and why the old approaches just won't work anymore. This event is sold out, however you can view it live via the Roaring Stories Facebook page. Until then, thanks very much for coming to another Roaring Stories event.